Chernobylite 2 Exclusion Zone is a sequel to Chernobylite 1. Both games take place in the Chernobyl zone. The first game focused on survival, base building and horror elements, while this one brings you more of the open world RPG experience, similar to Gothic 1 or maybe even better to Ryzen 1. Paired up with various systems, base building, base management, looting, crafting, better gear, exploring the world, making impactful story decisions, gaining faction reputation and probably much more. The second installment in the series is just insanely bigger than its predecessor. I've played nearly 30 hours of it and after a shaky start I can't wait to put twice as much into it. But I believe the 1.0 version of the game can bring you about 100 hours of fun. To give you a hint, that's how much map I've discovered after about 25 hours of playing. But is it this time actually a quality experience? Well, for me it was, but I'm sure many others will have a different opinion, so let's get into the details. Let's start with the story. I was mentioning that the start of the game is shaky in terms of, well, fun. To me, the beginning of the game is easily its worst part. We are bombarded with some game lore that doesn't seem to make any sense. So basically the original Chernobyl incident started some multiverse. I mean, it basically spawned countless alternate realities. And in some of those realities, from what I understand, the Chernobylite as a resource basically gave infinite power to people, and it fuels the most powerful civilization that managed to harness the potential inside of it. However, many other alternate realities weren't that lucky, and Chernobylite basically, devours or curses its inhabitants, turning these poor people into these so-called Chernohosts, something like a zombie. I think we are a guy from this most powerful civilization, right? That uses Chernobylite. And from what I understand, our family needs money. So we apply to some space marine program. Here it's called planewalkers, and we become a planewalker that walks planes. To harvest the Chernobylite to the super powerful civilization. But then our mothership explodes for no reason, and I don't think I'm not sure if we end up in the original Chernobyl zone or where, but we generally want to find the way back home. Don't worry if you've lost me like a minute ago. I don't know, guys. It doesn't make much sense to me, honestly. However, the story is actually pretty good if you forget the entire beginning of the game and all that bullshit. The main plot seems to be really dumb. Our main goal is to earn money for our family and to go back to the original super civilization, I think. I don't know how we as players are supposed to be engaged in the protagonist's motivations, because all exposition of his current problems, of his family and so on is basically non-existent. There was just a semi-optional talk with his wife. I think it was his wife. However, the story gets much better after like an hour of the tutorial. You get to choose the faction you want to initially side with. I didn't even complete this part fully, so I say initially because I think you get to work with all of them. This starts a series of quests that allow you to recruit companions from chosen faction into your base. At first the game doesn't seem very story heavy, but after some time it punches you with the realization that the choices you've made actually had consequences. And well, it's a nice surprise.
The restriction is not a way, and you should have informed me about everything in the first place.
When the game slows down with the whole multiverse bullshit, it starts to get actually interesting, and I found myself caring about the lore of the game, something I haven't done maybe since completing Cyberpunk 77. I'm also surprised at the quality of writing when it comes to dialogues, which are often smart or a little funny.
What's on today's training agenda?
I believe you can explain how to pack more stuff into my inventory. How are you even qualified to teach this stuff to me?
Ha! You tell me.
I'm sure you picked it up in the slammer. With so little space and guards snooping about, you probably had to learn how to fit all your contraband up your arsehole.
Oh, fuck off. You're lucky you were never in prison. Or perhaps you were, and hence the knowledge of assholes.
Of course, the level of writing isn't even across the game, but I would say it's overall above average, or way above average if we consider the most recent titles.
So, I'm non-binary.
Same goes with voice acting. It's more often a hit, but sometimes it's a miss. For example, Igor sounds more like a hobo with 30 years of alcoholism experience rather than Batman.
It's very dangerous though, so you'll need backup. The Chernobylite breach runs on a mix of quantum entanglement and something I don't yet fully understand.
And yes, sometimes the voice acting is replaced by the AI-generated voice.
I'll tell you, we tried. In fact, we tried all those crazy, supernatural theories.
But these are only placeholders, guys. And the developers explained they were surprised it was such a big issue, and in April they plan to add full voice acting to the early access content, as well as the fixes to localization issues. Companions is a topic of its own. I was really enjoying that part of the game. They give you quests which allow you to learn more about their past motivations and their role inside the faction. Something like in Veilguard actually, but to me much better, because it pushes the main story. The choices you make during these quests might have consequences. They might affect the future story or whether you gain a reputation with them or not. It's important to listen carefully as this will help you make good decisions. Gaining reputation with companions unlocks new content, for example new dialogue choices that enable you to learn even more about them. For an open world, the story is a bit on rails. You do not have a quest log. It seems you can do one quest during the day and one quest during the night, and usually you have no choice what quest it will be. It's weird to see that in open world RPG, but it's hard to say whether it's good or bad. After all, having your journal full of unfinished quests isn't especially pleasing experience either. So depending on your taste, it might be a limiting factor or a refreshing change. When we talk about day and night, the time in the game simply doesn't progress at all on its own. Theoretically, you can farm as much as possible during the first day of the game without it ever ending on its own. When you talk to Igor in your base, you will have a choice to go to sleep. Later in the game, you will have a choice to decide if you sleep full night and wake up in the morning, or if you want to do some activities during the night. At first I was bothered by that, being used to the natural time progression in games. However, I quickly got used to it and started to even like it, because this allows developers to make the passage of time meaningful for story and game mechanics, at the same time giving the players all the time in the world for farming their resources or doing whatever they like. RPG means a lot of stats, character sheet, new skills, and so on. And I have to say the game doesn't disappoint here. If you plan on playing the game longer, I actually recommend taking your sweet time and fully understanding every stat there is in the game. Many of these are straightforward and work like in other games, for example health, stamina regeneration. These are the same as in Elden Ring or Dark Souls. The essence is basically your mana. Then there's shield, which was the most confusing for me, because it doesn't reduce the damage you take. I mean, it does in some weird way, so it's more like energy shield in Path of Exile. You see, Chernobylite influences creatures inside the zone, and all of them get a natural recharging shield of some amount. After damaging it, it recharges after a few seconds of not taking damage, and it's provided by your armor pieces. Enemies also have that shield. Then each attribute affects the stats we've already mentioned. You need them for various stat checks, for example in the open world, to open a chest or to squeeze through some opening. Then you also need them to wear a good weapon or armor. By the way, there is a lot of criticism from me here because every two-handed sword requires intelligence, for example, or perception, which doesn't make sense at all. It's super annoying and I hope they fix this quickly, because as a full warrior, it's a miracle for me to find any fitting sword I can even use, which is just stupid. When it comes to character development, there are also classes, and at the start of the game, after a very short section, you can choose from 6 different classes. I've chosen a warrior, which is all about strength and survivability. So the game has 3 main classes: a guy with guns, like a ranger, a melee warrior, and a mage wearing special Chernobylite gloves that eat essence, so you shoot magic with your fingers. And then there are 3 additional classes to choose from, which are a mix of the above. So a mix of a warrior and a gunner and a mage and a warrior. Not only that, but later in the game you can unlock up to 3 additional slots for your classes. So basically you can have 4 builds at a time. Essentially that means that you don't even need to stick to the class you initially taken, and you only need to beat the game once in order to experience everything basically it has to offer. I'm not sure if I'm a fan of that, but I guess a lot of people will be happy about this. So yeah, you have basically up to 4 presets of these classes. So we can have a warrior preset, mage preset, ranger preset, and something in between preset. When it comes to my choice of the warrior, I'm really enjoying it, but I've also heard good words about the mage class too. I didn't hear from anyone about the class using mainly guns, so I don't know about this one. Guns seem very strong though, so maybe if there are complaints it's that it's too easy, who knows. All of these classes can learn abilities from faction companions that allow you to use additional tools in your combat and outside of it. Learning a new skill is also interesting. It's Gothic style, even more than Gothic style. You need to talk and find the person which will teach you a certain skill. Moreover, learning a skill isn't simply choosing a dialogue option. You will have a tiny quest associated with the newly learned move, so you can test it in action. At other times, you will need to solve a quiz about bodybuilding. Good luck. My thoughts about combat will come mainly from a melee perspective. While writing this, I realized how little 25 hours is in order to experience every aspect of the combat system, especially on a higher difficulty. I simply didn't have time to play a mage, but I've used guns as a warrior from time to time, but had no experience of using them exclusively too. I think, however, that both the gunner and the mage are expected to use melee weapons simply to save the ammo or mana when the enemies aren't too difficult. Melee weapons are simply too good for the fact that you can use them infinitely. Let's talk about combat mechanics. There is dodge roll like Dark Souls, which also has iframes, which means there is a brief time during the roll at which you don't take any damage. It costs you stamina, so you can't spam it. The game includes stealth, which is especially worth your time while using a melee weapon. You can backstab enemies, both during sneaking but also during combat. If you've played some of the Dark Souls games, you should notice that backstabbing in the game is actually quite easy, maybe a bit too easy. I like it as it is because I like feeling strong, but maybe on higher difficulties the angle at which you can backstab the enemy should be adjusted to be less forgiving. You can also stagger enemies and do a special critical hit if you hit them while they are blocking your hits. There is also a specific stat for that, block breaking. Stagger works similarly to backstab. You use a regular attack while the dot on the enemy flashes red. During these animations you cannot take damage, so I feel like it's always worth it to use them when you are surrounded by enemies. Blocking is extremely strong in this game. Blocking with your weapon in Souls-likes is usually not worth it, and you need to use a shield. But in this game we have no shields, from what I know at least. So blocking with your melee weapon was made much stronger. If you perfectly block a melee attack, you can stagger the enemy. If you perfectly time the block of a projectile, you will return it back to the owner. On top of that, every weapon can be either physical or elemental. There are 4 elements that I encountered. Energy, which is closest to lightning, then fire, cold, and radiation. Enemies can use different elements. For example, an enemy which uses a fire weapon will be weak to your cold damage sword. Everything can deal elemental damage, meaning you can fire cold or lightning bullets with your gun, or enjoy having a burning sword. Enemies have various abilities. At the start of the game they have 1 or 2 attacks, but their arsenal quickly grows, and if you find yourself surrounded, you're going to have a bad time. Quite an interesting thing is that enemies have friendly fire. This makes combat more interesting, as you can use it to your advantage at times. For example, position yourself between some ranged enemy and melee enemy, so the melee enemy gets damaged by its ally. However, this doesn't speak too good about the enemy AI, and yet they could be a little smarter. Ranged enemies are especially stupid. They will attack their allies if they stand between you, Also, if you hide behind the corner, they won't try to flank you or anything. Instead, they will just shoot at the wall. Hope these things get fixed in future updates. That's obviously not everything, but let's stop here. To me, combat is fun. The game's developers managed to find a common ground between good enough combat, but not too good. And what do I mean by that? Isn't the combat supposed to be the best possible? Personally, in games that are heavy in RPG elements and have multiple systems, I prefer the combat to be not too complicated and robust, so we as players don't drown in the game's scope. The good old saying that sometimes less is more. I see it this way: there's good enough melee fighting, good enough shooting, and I don't know about spellcasting. I was having fun, and that's basically it. But if you look for the best combat experience, Dark Souls or Elden Ring fighting, yeah, that's not what this game is really about. Bosses are also a big part of the combat experience. The best way I could describe bosses would be soul-light. These are the lighter, easier and less polished, obviously, version of Dark Souls' major adversaries. Again, the game doesn't try to beat Elden Ring at its job, so that's something I expected, honestly. Still, some boss enemies have interesting mechanics that with small adjustments will make up for cool fights. I've encountered some major fights in my gameplay, and these bosses were sadly the worst I encountered. Not going deep here to avoid spoilers, but they need some work as the hitboxes leave a lot to be desired when we fight bigger foes. Balance of the fights is also a bit interesting right now. When it comes to difficulty, the game has a ton of difficulty options and you can adjust your experience however you like. This might be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on who you ask really. Having more static difficulty options is better because you can compare yourself easier to others. However, having them detailed also allows you to adjust your experience to your likings better. I've chosen normal difficulty, assuming it's the one intended by the developers. And because I like challenging open world encounters and also to have more resources drop for me, I increased the size of open world enemy groups. I also found regular stat checks in the open world way too harsh, so I've decided to reduce the difficulty of stat checks. The beginning of the game is super easy, and if you play a ranged class like a mage or a gunner, I would say it's trivial. The melee enemies at the beginning have no tools to fight you. That, however, changes over time. As the game progresses, the fights become more and more difficult. You meet new types of enemies, and they have a lot of moves in order to close the gap between you. The difficulty ramps up quickly, so you might end up not having good enough gear in order to deal with enemies. The difficulty works in this way: the further from your base you go, the harder it gets, and there is no level scaling, so fights get insanely difficult if you wander into higher level places. That also means low level enemies around your base, and they spawn frequently. And these are easy to kill and drop a decent amount of resources, so if you find yourself low on something, that's an easy way to farm. If you struggle with difficulty, here's another tip for you. I learned only later in the game that crafting your own armor pieces in the base for just a few resources brings you great quality equipment. I was stuck with body armor I found at the game's beginning, as no upgrade has dropped. With an armor workstation, I crafted this upgrade for just a bunch of resources. Because you can get a full refund from building your workstation, you can dismantle it after you are done with the crafting, and then craft a workstation for another armor piece. If you really want to cheat a little, you can also save before crafting a piece of your gear. The stats it gets are random, so you can load the game until you hit some small jackpot. This helps you greatly if you struggle, but it doesn't work with weapons. Getting a good weapon is much harder, especially that you should have weapons with multiple elements to deal with different enemies. The only tip I have is to save the game before some boss fight and farm the boss until some good weapon drops. Sometimes vendors also have decent weapons to buy. What I don't like about the difficulty is definitely that enemies like to spam the attacks too often. They have no cooldown, and in some cases it's absolutely insane, especially these gargoyles that are as annoying as in Dark Souls series, so a few adjustments are for sure needed and balance needs to be adjusted, but for early access I don't have major complaints. Naturally I play melee and well, I'm quite good at the game, your experience might vary. And yeah, it's also only medium settings, so your experience might vary greatly if you choose a different build or different difficulty. The game's world is massive, that's how much I've discovered being close to 30 hours in the game. When you look around the zone, you can notice two major things. First is the spaceship. I think it's the spaceship we came from that got somehow attacked by the Chernobylite. I think we are in the real timeline, like the real one. And after the attack of the spaceship, the dome, right, then there is a dome. The dome, I think, was created when our spaceship basically blew up, and it separated us from the super civilization in this very timeline we are playing in. So it separated us from our home, right? At the beginning, things were going slowly when it comes to exploring, because, well, only later I realized you can teleport to any previously discovered teleporter at will, just by opening your map and clicking on it. Well, that's convenient, and a bit too convenient to me. I thought originally that you need to first approach a teleporter in order to teleport to the other one. I played mostly like this, and it was much more fun than teleporting at will. That for sure speeds things up in a game that is already massive, so I don't mind. Game's open world seems more alive thanks to the fact that groups of enemies can be hostile to each other and fight. You get full XP when they kill each other, even when you don't intervene at all. I consider it a feature, not a bug. After all, when two are fighting, there are the benefits. One thing I don't like, however, are these weird Chernobylite islands. They look a bit out of place, artificial, and quite ugly, I would say. I'd either rework them to be something more fitting or straight up delete them, because they don't even offer good loot. The exploring is made more interesting through secret spots that sometimes you might encounter, and if you have enough of a required attribute, you'll get some loot. The zone is also filled with places you can scan with your tablet that will reveal short scenes that give more context and lore of the world. Usually I don't like stuff like that, finding it a little boring. But in this case, these scenes are usually shorter than 15 seconds, so you don't really mind scanning stuff with your tablet to unlock some short scene. Overall, I like the implementation of this open world. I think the game could use some randomly generated encounters or like quests that infinitely can spawn, because sometimes traveling through the world can get monotonous. Just fighting random groups of enemies and maybe from time to time scanning for resources. There could be something more to that, I feel like, despite the game having 1,000 of systems already, right? Maybe just delete some useless system and add that, I don't know. I also have one big complaint. The faction bases are really underwhelming. I mean, it's close to 30 hours and I have seen only the mutants base. But I have doubts if the other factions have done better. You see, one of the main factions' headquarters looks like just a random bunch of buildings with some tiny wall around it. When you enter, you have a single vendor and a few NPCs that just stay there. The game is really showing here its small budgets. You can't see the base from a distance even, and when you are near it, it's even hard to tell where it starts. There's basically no unique features to it or artistic design that would allow you to look at the base and say, damn, that's a cool mutant base. The game has a lot of systems and activities. There is reputation, companions, base building, base management, planewalker outposts that bring energy to your base, survival elements, crafting, night missions, and more. I think that the game does a good job of making these systems lean more to the simpler side, so we all don't drown in the game's complexity. For example, the survival aspect of the game is very easy to grasp. We have 5 stats we need to care about. When you kill too many human enemies, your mind level decreases and you need to take antidepressants to refill it. If you don't, you will gain small stat penalties. This isn't complicated and quite easy to remember, but of course it lacks depth some people would have expected. You also have, for example, a few resources, and you can find all of these resources in just anything. So it's also a more shallow system because you don't need to look for a specific resource anywhere. It's hard to say if it's good or bad. I think that the game has so many systems that they needed to make them simpler. At the same time, I feel like in some areas the game could just cut some content or like some systems, and then this space would allow for some other more important systems to the game to be deeper and thus more interesting. I feel like the game might have a little, maybe even too much of these systems. We will see how will the game look in its final form, because the devs said something about reducing the scope after not so good early access stats. Basically, you know, they don't have as much money as they thought they would have after the early access release. This sounds a bit depressing, but I think it might be good for the game. I feel like this game needs some rational scope management. It seems a bit too broad, too big. A lot of people question the game, saying it doesn't know what it wants to be. I didn't have that feeling, to be honest, but I do feel that some of these systems could be removed or could be done in a different, more interesting way while not being as complex still. So there's that. When you approach a terminal in your base, you can start a lobby for the night mission. It's about a few hours into the game when you can do that. The mode is a roguelike, which brings you quite decent loot. You travel from island to island doing various tasks, and after you complete them, you have a choice which island is next. This is the only way you can play with friends so far. Also, developers said that they heard players' feedback on expanding co-op, so it might be a subject to change. However, I don't recommend playing much of this mode as of now. If you are watching this video like a week since I posted it, I don't recommend. Despite good loot dropping there. I've done that, and well, as of now it's in an awful technical state. Sometimes it simply doesn't start. After you kill the boss, the game for some reason asks you if you want to leave, when the boss has 2 legendary items waiting for you. If you decline, it kicks you out anyway after like 2 seconds, and in order to loot the boss you need to approach it in a very weird angle, so most of the time you don't even get your legendary hard-earned items, which is super annoying. So my advice for now, if you watch this around the early access release, I wouldn't play co-op to spare you annoyance. Graphics quality as of now is a bit uneven, although generally I think it's pretty enough for me. I think it's really pretty, especially at the higher settings. But yeah, still a bit uneven. There are moments when the game looks ugly, and there are times when it's a looker. It's crucial to talk about the vibe and the atmosphere compared to the first game. Many people say that the game doesn't have the vibe of the first one, also graphically, and I disagree. The first 1 or 2 hours into the game, with all that sci-fi bullshit, it's looking much different than the first game, yes. But as you progress, the game gets a much more similar vibe that the veterans of the first game are familiar with. To sum up, I think that the game has very good graphics, especially pretty landscapes. But sometimes it lacks in effects, so just as I said, it's uneven. There are scenes or specific assets that just don't fit or look bad for some reason. And yes, sometimes they are just awful. For example, look at these fireballs. I mean, I hope that's a placeholder. The current technical state of the game is easily its worst part. Optimization is just bad. These are my current specs, and I assure you things wouldn't get better if I had a better PC. Sadly, the game runs on Unreal Engine 5, and I'm a bit worried if the developers will manage to pull it off. That being said, they did optimize Chernobylite 1 very well over time, and it was also Unreal Engine, so I do have hope. I need to play on medium graphics settings, and I get between 30 to 50 FPS depending on location. Also, there's a lot of quite annoying stuttering, but only when traversing the open world. When it comes to bugs and issues, I have some good news and some bad news. During about 30 hours I have never experienced a game-breaking bug or anything that would disrupt my gameplay in a major way, or made me unable to progress. To me, for early access, that's quite good. I also have never crashed. But I know people have different experiences, especially with different setups, so take these words with a grain of salt. Overall, I feel like Chernobylite 2 will be a game hated by some and loved by the others. It's a unique mix of many genres. It's a looter, story-focused RPG with Dark Souls melee combat and guns. It has a lot of similarities to Gothic 1 and 2, base building and survival parts of Fallout. It has enormous open world and a big ambition. The game contains a ton of different systems and mechanics, which means that sometimes those mechanics are a bit oversimplified, like the survival part of the game, or simply undercooked, like the faction bases. If you can forgive quite an interesting beginning of the game and the game's systems are up your valley, the game can offer you 100 hours of quite decent quality fun. However, if you like your game perfect, bugs-free, great experience from start to finish, polished, with perfect scope, well, the game can have too many downsides for you as of now. It's hard to judge what will come out of this game at the 1.0 release, but I have high hopes because I had fun. So while I would give this game as of now like 6 out of 10, and it's still by turning a blind eye at some of these technical issues, in the best case scenario the full release could be even an 8 out of 10 title, so quite high. And that's it from me, guys. It's a big review anyway, so thanks for watching and let me know what do you think about this title.